Then I'm going to pass over to you, and what I'll do then is I'll turn off the microphone, not the microphone, turn off my microphone and turn off my camera, so you have the floor. I know it'll be like looking into the abyss, but please don't let that put you off. It might give you a bit, it might make you feel a bit safer actually. Um, okay, so let's start without further ado. The SIAH PGR seminar for November. I had to think about what date it was because we're so close to December now. And I'd really like to welcome you all to a talk by Kristina Risley, which is called A Delphi Method Investigation into Serious Gaming, Harnessing a State of Flow for Leadership Development. I'm going to read a little bit about Kristina now, and then we'll talk about her, go through her abstract, and then I'll pass over to Kristina. Okay, so Kristina is a postgraduate researcher at the University of Southampton, investigating immersive experiences in serious games for leadership development. She is also visiting lecturer at Southampton and a number of other universities, with HR, leadership and development and research methods being her main focuses. She holds a BSc in psychology, an MSc in human resource management and a PG Cert in learning and teaching. Before moving to academia, Kristina spent 10 years in senior HR roles, primarily in the NHS, up to and including board level. Her main career focus has been leadership and organisational development, particularly how people initiatives add value to organisations. Kristina is a Chartered Fellow of the CIPD, a member of the Division of Occupational Psychology for the British Psychological Society, and a Fellow of the Higher Education Academy. More latterly, Kristina has been representing the university with the Serious Games Society Research Network and is chair of the Games and Learning Alliance Conference's Serious Games Competition of the Year. Now that is a complete tongue twister. A marvellous profile there, Kristina. So to talk about, in response to your paper today, this is your abstract. Serious games have been on the rise as experiential learning interventions in recent years, but remain relatively infrequently used for leadership development in business. Theoretical thinking in the field of serious games consistently includes an immersive state of flow as a core principle for increasing learner engagement and motivation. However, academic discussions stop short of exploring flow as a catalyst for socially constructed realities in which learners can live out various situations to experientially develop their leadership skills. This research seeks to contribute to the organisation's effective development of leaders by outlining a framework to capitalise on the benefits of using serious games. It also aims to inform improvements in pedagogical understanding and practices surrounding leadership development. The key question being addressed by this research is, what are the optimal components and processes of flow generating serious games, and how can these enable the development of critical leadership skills? That sounds fantastic, Kristina. Please, over to you. I'm really looking forward to hearing this. Thank you.
Thank you for that lovely introduction, Jo. Yeah, and thank you everyone for the opportunity to present a little bit of my work so far. So of course, my name is Kristina. I'm a second year PhD student here at the University of Southampton. I'm part-time PhD student. My friends will also tell you that I'm a massive gamer, or at least I would be if I had time. Obviously being a PhD student. And so I'm really pleased to introduce my kind of ongoing work into serious games here. I believe that game-based learning can address really many of the problems that we encounter as educators in higher education, as well as the kind of corporate learning challenges that I encountered during my industry career. And so I feel like there are a lot of opportunities really for us to kind of capitalize on. And what I'd like to talk you through is the first phase of my research. So it's the first phase of 3, as we'll kind of unpack as we go along, really. So overall today, I'd like to discuss then the first phase of my research. So far, I've conducted a Delphi investigation into serious games and how they could be used for leadership development, potentially. We'll discuss the general approach and my findings a little bit more as we go along. But here is the kind of roadmap really for the time that we have together. And I'll try to be very careful to stick to time if I can. I'll define serious games, which I realize is it's the kind of thing that we're, I think, discussing a lot, but what does it really mean? Also briefly discuss some of the associated benefits that kind of come along with the usage of serious games. And then I want to zone in a little more on engagement and an immersive state of flow in terms of learning. So this is really the theoretical base for my research. I'll provide a brief introduction to my research in terms of the methodology and the approach. And then finally, I'll kind of summarize the results that I have to date and to give a bit of an indication of the next steps that I'm planning, really. I would really appreciate your questions, comments, feedback, really on everything. So whether you agree, disagree, and so on, and particularly about my next potential phase. If there are any suggestions, then it's something I would be certainly very grateful for. Joe and I, of course, were just talking about I suppose the wealth of advice that I've been given so far, really, and just suggestions for people, and none of them really have ever not been helpful. So actually, they have always led really to some kind of and I don't want to say breakthrough, but they certainly have led to some kind of direction change or some kind of addition that's really added benefit. So in terms of serious games, then I just want to give a bit of I suppose an explanation, and it is certainly one person's explanation of what they are and really what we can use them for. So in terms of what serious games are, there are lots of different definitions. Some overlap with other areas such as simulated learning, gamified learning. For the purposes of my research, I think Marsh's definition here would be kind of most appropriate. So you can see digital games, simulations, virtual environments, mixed reality media potentially that provide opportunities to engage in activities through responsive narrative or story, gameplay or encounters to inform, to influence, for well-being. Could also be to experience or to convey meaning in some way. And it goes on to say that serious games are defined along a continuum, really, from games for purpose at one end through to experiential environments with really minimal or no gaming characteristics, maybe like immersive environments in the world of VR and so on, really at the other end. So it really is a big kind of spectrum, and debates are ongoing about what fits where and all of those kind of things for sure. I think you've become a fully fledged discipline when people start arguing about what it's called, which is a very good sign for serious games. Actually, those in the entertainment industry tend to dislike the phrase serious games and tend to think that it's a bit more outdated, actually. If anybody follows the BAFTAs at all, then you'll probably know they introduced a category called game beyond entertainment. And so this is certainly a phrase that's associated probably more in kind of entertainment circles for kind of obvious reasons. And that's exactly what these games are. So kind of digital games, often very much based in simulation. And the intent really is training or educating in some way, more often than not, but still with the same characteristics that you see in games in most cases. So that might include progressive levels of difficulty, immediate and ongoing feedback, scoring or rewards for success, leaderboards, and so on. These kind of things, really. Lots of different serious games on the market, and Joe and I, we were just talking about Duolingo is probably one of the more popular ones that we've come across kind of just recently. Duolingo is an example of a serious game, so it's an opportunity to add kind of, I suppose, game or playful elements to something that maybe isn't something that we find it easy to learn in a traditional way, kind of thing. Among the probably the most famous serious games, probably I would say the most long-standing really is one called America's Army, which is, there's a little kind of snippet from it in the top right up there. So this is actually a series of first-person shooter games that were designed and published by the US Army, and the game's designed to allow prospective soldiers to try their life in the army and decide whether they like it, really. So the roles, the tasks, whether the lifestyle is suited to them, essentially. Another example that you might classify in this kind of category, you might not, depending on your philosophical bent, is Microsoft Flight Simulator game. And then also there's one called Fligby, which is the kind of bottom left, which I massively recommend. It's a rare people management simulation where the player undertakes the role of a general manager of a winery, and you need to make several kind of challenging business or human resource decisions in order to make sure the company is successful across a range of different kind of performance metrics, which for an HR nerd like me who's way into games, it just is heaven. It's a fabulous game. And then the last one here on this slide is Sea Hero Quest, which is actually not used for training as such, but I think it deserves an honorable mention, really, because it was designed as a research tool to better understand spatial reasoning in humans. And it's actually led to lots of advances in our understanding of dementia, and especially early onset dementia. I mean, so this is just a snapshot of what is actually hundreds of thousands, I mean, maybe millions of games that are out there on the market. But you can, I think, just see how really variable this kind of area is. There's a whole spectrum, and I won't dive into it too much at all, but really spans repurposing entertainment games for education to serious games that are designed for a specific educational purpose, like the likes of Duolingo. Lots of other ones. There's one called Plaguing, which is a simulation game where players actually need to evolve a deadly virus that can infect and kill the world's population, which is quite extreme, I know. But the game has been used in courses related to biology, medicine, public health, and it's all about understanding how viruses work and how they're spread. So you can see the massive, real positive kind of benefit that kind of games for good that is a particular trend in the industry at the minute. Another example, and I'll try not to go through too many, but there are just so many of them, is actually from a friend of mine called Rene Rioche, and he's developed I suppose a game based on another kind of virus almost. So it's about hackers. And in this game, you play the position of a hacker and you create like a phishing emails to try to get people's personal details and so on. And then by understanding the kind of mindset and the tactics of the hacker, you're kind of more protected. There's lots that I've seen in higher education, which I won't go into really any detail about, but for instance, management of a supply chain. So the whole game is learning to manage a supply chain. Here at Southampton, we actually use a game called Mark Strat currently on our global advertising and branding course, which probably unsurprisingly from the name is all about marketing strategy. So there's so many, and I think probably more than you could play in an entire lifetime. Some of the benefits then associated with them. So I think the reason that many of these games are increasingly being created is because, quite frankly, the research would suggest that this is a better way to learn experientially than really anything universities or training companies can viably do within their resource constraints. And this is very much where my personal interest came in, other than the fact that I am a gamer myself. I spent a lot of my industry career in the cash-strapped NHS, really unable with the kind of budget that we had available to be able to do leadership development en masse. And it kind of struck me that this is the kind of thing that would actually make a huge difference. But some of the kind of key benefits, and this is just a few amongst a huge list, really. So simulations allow for faster development of complex skills. So this is really by replicating situations and scenarios that learners just won't encounter regularly. So things like severe conflict in the workplace, pandemics, financial collapse, and so on. And really every variable can be quite easily controlled and manipulated. And actually these learning opportunities are replayable, which means that learners can kind of go back and find out what would have happened if they'd chosen another course of action instead. Which is actually a real positive benefit for sure. A sense of psychological safety tends to really accompany this kind of intervention, and it allows learners to take risks and, as I've said, explore kind of alternative courses of action without potentially career-ending consequences that actually they could face in real life if they took some of these decisions. So put simply, we can allow people to fail safely in a way that they really just can't in real life, particularly in really highly pressured leadership situations, like the likes of which, of course, I obviously saw in the NHS. A big part of this is learning to self-regulate in terms of leadership development, and this comes from kind of enhanced feedback abilities when it comes to serious games. So they provide the ability for immediate feedback, which can occur really very frequently, kind of throughout the game. And it allows learners to evolve their approach in real time and to adjust the kind of techniques and their attitude and their approach and their use of soft skills essentially in real time. So this could be things like different options opening up based on decisions a player's made, or different options closing down that won't be an option in future, for example. Feedback from in-game characters is another one that's typically used, and leaderboards and things like that as well. And then, of course, just whether they actually progress through the game or not to what we would call the win state, or the lose state if they lose, is of course really very useful feedback as well. So progression through levels and all of this kind of stuff. And then ultimately, this is being found to translate into better learning transfer ultimately. So regarding soft skills, learning via serious games has been found to increase learners' ability to kind of self-analyze, to develop conscious awareness of their own skill gaps, make adjustments to their behavior in a way that's really kind of quite self-directed. So actually being able to transfer the skill that they've built within the game, or that they've developed further within the game, to other kind of learning context or to other real world context is a real benefit that's been associated with serious games in the research. So there's quite a lot there. As I said, this is really not an exhaustive list. These are just the kind of main ones that certainly jump out. In terms of learner engagement, and I suppose the theoretical basis for my study, really, I wanted to talk a little bit more about how this might kind of how this might occur, and some of the, I suppose, foundations ultimately that fit along with immersive experience. And so I suppose my first question is, and maybe you could give me like a thumbs up emoji, or yeah, I guess a little thumbs up emoji. So what I'm wondering is, do we have any gamers actually here in the audience? Do we have anybody who likes to play games? I'm obviously a massive one, so I can give a kind of thumbs up to that. We got a thumbs up. Yeah. I'm with you, gamers. I love it. What about runners? We were talking about this before. Anybody who's really into running at all? I'm a big runner as well. I think, Joe, you might have told me that you were a runner as well early on. By the way, I just want to grab you something while we're here. I also have just a link to a serious game for any runners as well. Musicians, writers, artists. Do we have any of those in the audience with us? Got a couple. Yeah. Nice one. So you're going to know what I mean. I'll stop asking for hands up and thumbs up and so on. But you'll know what I mean then, I imagine, when I say the zone. So this is, and feel free to put comments and questions and so on in the chat as well. So you'll know what I mean when I say the zone. So it's that kind of, especially gamers, runners, musicians, artists, writers, when you're absolutely in that kind of, I suppose, state of oneness with whatever task it is that you're kind of doing. And this really is the basis, the theoretical basis, yeah, for my study. So the early work on this phenomenon was done by a guy named Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, who is renowned as the father of positive psychology, and he devised this concept of flow, or total immersion in an activity. And I think between us here, we had somebody who fitted into every category. So hopefully we'll know what I mean when I say the zone kind of thing. It's a mental state where a person is fully immersed and kind of completely absorbed in an activity, to the point where they lose track of time, really become completely focused on the task at hand. You're almost instinctively doing the tasks. Nothing else is really in your thinking. So if you've been running for a while and you find that actually it's not difficult anymore, you're not really thinking about anything else, you're just kind of at one with the task. Or if you're like me and maybe you started to play a game at 10 a.m. and it was light outside and everything was fine, and then you seem to come back around into consciousness and it's 8 p.m. and you haven't moved for how many hours and it's gone dark and all of that kind of stuff. This is the zone. So this is, of course, otherwise known as flow. So this flow channel is said to exist at the kind of right balance between your skills and your challenges. So you can see, hopefully on here, the kind of right balance between your skills and your challenges. So this is when you're stretched, but you're not overstretched. So I think this is partly why it's been consistently associated with serious games, because this increasing kind of progressive levels of difficulty is a core way that people tend to stay engaged when they're playing games. If it got too easy and you went into a state of boredom instead, like this kind of one, then actually you would find it very difficult to stay engaged and to stay really interested. There's loads of research into the benefits of flow, and again, not an exhaustive list, but a few things that I wanted to highlight. So increased engagement, of course, with learning, more time spent learning and more enthusiasm to learn if you're, for example, playing a serious game and you achieve a state of flow, or if a state of flow is achieved during any learning situation, essentially. Improved retention and recall of information has been associated with having achieved a state of flow. And then enhanced creativity as well is something, and I believe there's a real strong link here potentially to serious games. So this kind of enhanced creativity, it tends to encourage people to think more freely and take risks, because there's a sense of psychological safety that is inherent in this flow experience. It comes along with reduced stress, removal of external stresses and pressures is a big part of that, of course. And then ultimately improved performance, because people learn skills more quickly, they gain a sense of confidence more quickly. So this is the kind of thing that I think, in terms of serious games, absolutely all serious games, we should be looking to capitalize on more. It's part of the research typically, but it's not something that has been really, I think, explored in enough depth, particularly around leadership development, in my particular opinion. So a little bit then about, I suppose, the overall intention of my research and the kind of phases that I'm going through. So my work sits where these kind of three fields of study intersect. So kind of here in the middle, as you can see. So we're looking to explore the kind of dynamics of experiential leadership development, investigate this high performance state of flow as a kind of facilitator of all of that, and additionally uncover the dimensions of socially constructed realities that kind of come along with these games, in which soft skills development can occur, really. So I believe this additional area might relate to the concept of team or group flow, especially. More recently, this has been referred to as co-flow, which I quite like. So this is where more than one person is immersed in the zone, essentially. So more than one person in a team has achieved the state of flow in parallel. There's not, as you can imagine, not nearly as much research about this as the individual flow state. So there's a lot there to kind of explore further. And then I also think that these socially constructed realities and the environments that they might produce and how they can, I suppose, be used to hone soft skills development is really important in an increasingly digitalized world. But actually, again, something that has been kind of under researched to this point. So when we're really immersed in these environments and essentially this socially constructed reality has emerged and we're acting within it, what are the interplays and what are the kind of interactions of that, and how does one kind of lead to the other, and how does one interact with the other? So it's not something that is being hugely explored, and I'm looking for convergence ultimately of these kind of three ideas. So my research question then, as Joe said, is what are the optimal components and processes of flow generating serious games, and how can they enable the development of critical soft skills? These are my research objectives, and I won't go through them in really any detail, partly because actually I think I'm about to add another to them, and you can maybe when we get to questions at the end, you can give me some thoughts on this, and I can kind of take you through what I'm intending to add to the next phase of my research. Ultimately, though, I'm looking to investigate these three things within the growing body of literature in these areas, but also by exploring the experience of experts in their relevant fields. And this is what I've already started with my Delphi approach. So ultimately, this work is hopefully going to lead to the synthesis of an explanatory framework, so something that outlines what makes serious games effective and how they can be best utilized to develop those really kind of complex but critical, what we might call soft skills that we need for good leadership, essentially. These are the phases that I have planned for my research. So I've completed phase one, which I want to talk you through in a bit more detail in the time that we have left over. So I've used Delphi methodology with various practitioners in the fields of serious games, leadership development, and the intention of this was really to identify the kind of criteria and the experts really that I will then interview during semi-structured interviews, but then also to define what the key constructs are, exactly what it is that we're looking into in more depth, essentially. The original plan, I would have gone straight to phase two, which would have been phase three, which would have been phase two. And so this is semi-structured interviews. So once those constructs are kind of identified, really going through and having these in-depth conversations with the experts themselves. And these experts, I have a slide to show you in a little while, but they make up games designers, serious games experts of various varieties, and then also leadership development experts, some within higher education, some within a more corporate kind of training question, within a more kind of training context, really. So what I've decided to add, I think, and you can give me some feedback on this one, is a new phase two. So out of my research, I've come across some really strong, I think, constructs to evaluate a little bit further. And a little bit later on, I want to run you through my ideas for an ethnographic study, essentially, of what I'll watch people's gameplay experiences and then also can observe and kind of question based on these core constructs, which are quite difficult, quite challenging to really identify out of the Delphi approach. Nevertheless, I would like to talk you through the Delphi approach. So as I said, my participants ranged from quite a lot of different kind of experiences. They came from a really diverse background. 20 started out in the study. I had a 90% retention rate, which was 18 people by the end. This is above, though, the British Psychological Society's accepted standard of 70% for kind of Delphi research. This initial phase of research, this is where participants kind of completed anonymous, open-ended, but iterative questionnaires, and it was over 3 rounds. So my 20 participants, which then of course went to 18 participants by the end, they were asked 5 open-ended questions via questionnaire, and then all of the data kind of gathered in, analyzed, looking for areas of agreement and areas of disagreement or areas to explore further. And then at the end of each round, I produced a summary document of all of the anonymized responses and sent them back then to participants. And these were used to inform the next set of questions. So typically in a Delphi study, these rounds continue until consensus is reached. Broad consensus was reached in 3 rounds in this case, although participants were prepared to go to 5 rounds, which I think, would have taken a bit of a while. So I've said already, as you can see here, that participants were some were experts in flow, some in serious games, some in leadership development, some games designers as well, as you can see, actually working within industry. What we often had is we kind of had experts who had really more than one hat, I suppose, more than one area of expertise. And so just for the sake of reporting, really, I've just kind of gone with the dominant one. But typically we had quite a few participants who were almost a jack of all trades, and they had expertise in all, or if not, then the majority of the kind of areas we were looking at. 50% of participants worked in education, although again, there was some crossover here. 30% in non-higher education leadership development. So this is corporate leadership development. 20% were strictly kind of games design in game studios. And then the majority of participants were in the UK, 60%, the rest from the United States and the rest of Europe. And then so each round of these responses, I kind of gathered in these responses and then used thematic analysis and in vivo to gather these themes. So gathered all of the initial themes together, and I've got the kind of key constructs ultimately pulled out for us to have a bit of a discussion about together. But I just wanted to briefly show you some of the things that came out really. So round one, the kind of opening questions really tended to center around advancements in leadership development, those kind of ideal conditions for soft skills development and also immersive experiences, serious games and whether they're a viable kind of experiential learning mechanism essentially, and then the role of social learning as well in soft skills development. We achieved consensus quite quickly over a few things, as you can see here. So the likes of how crucial it is for soft skills to be developed as part of leadership development and how central it is. And there was a lot of agreement around a sense of psychological safety and just how important that is, as well as the importance of people experiencing kind of real life consequences, essentially. And then one thing that came out a lot was about feedback, reflection, role modeling and social interactions being a really, really important part. So I was keen to dig into these things a little bit further. There were some things that we didn't have consensus on in this kind of first early round. And so part of this was about how learning transfer can actually be achieved through experiential learning and particularly serious games. There were some people who really weren't that convinced about serious games, particularly from the outset. And so the merits and the challenges was something that I wanted to dig into a little bit further. And then also a bit more about the nature of social learning, as you can imagine. By round two, I think you can see from the kind of, I suppose, list of consensus and the list of things to explore further, it really felt like we were making some progress really quite quickly. The round two questions were largely about feedback for learners, probably unsurprising, learn and transfer, reward and how we might incorporate reward into serious games and to experiential leadership development, cooperative versus competitive learning, which might be better, which might be kind of more effective, and then some of the challenges associated with digital learning. Interestingly, there were a few things that came out of this that were quite surprising, really. So, for instance, intrinsic motivation being really powerful in terms of learning transfer was not a surprise, but I was surprised to see how cautious a lot of people were about extrinsic rewards. And this was a really different approach really to what I was expecting and to my own opinion before all of this. There were a lot of challenges actually there was agreement on as well in terms of serious games. So cost effectiveness, a simulation gap. So how realistic and how kind of authentic essentially is the experience to real life, and then cultural and potentially generational issues as well. It's worth noting that some of these cultural and generational issues are actually some criticisms of the idea of flow in the first place. So I think there's more to uncover and more to kind of unpack there. And so some things that I wanted to explore further, of course, like the ideal balance then between competitive and cooperative, and a bit more about what that kind of meant. And then whether extrinsic rewards really were suitable at all within kind of gamification techniques, essentially. These are the core constructs that came out as a result of all of the kind of three rounds. So I will, as I said, I won't go through all of them, but the kind of big ones that really jump out. Psychological safety was absolutely huge, as you can imagine, and the authenticity of the learning experience. And then feedback was a big part of this. And as you might imagine, a lot of the things that kind of fit into social learning, which is of particular interest, as you can imagine, around the kind of social constructionist approach. So the kind of thematic analysis of the responses would suggest that serious games are best when they're finely tuned to match the player's ability level, which might not be that surprising to, I suppose, most of us. But this was echoed in really the vast majority of the kind of responses around the subject. So this was echoed in calls around personalized feeding, kind of learning paths, adaptable difficulty settings, feedback mechanisms, a lot of the things that keep players really, I suppose, engaged in the learning process. But also, I think there was no dispute over the kind of the retention of leadership skills, I suppose, and the development of leadership skills that came out as part of all of this. And then there was a lot there that I thought that linked to social constructionism also. So social constructionism, of course, emphasizes the ways that individuals and groups construct their reality essentially through social interaction and through shared understandings. And this really resonated with a lot of the responses around cultural relevance, collaborative learning, and the kind of social context that were built in and around serious games. So I think it was clear really that leadership games need to be able to foster those kind of social learning environments. And um, this came out particularly around the discussion of kind of competitive versus cooperative games for sure as well. So there's certainly something that needs to be unpacked a little bit further there. And then, of course, there was some discussion, as you might imagine, about the recognition of diverse leadership styles and the importance of context and the kind of narrative that the game in terms of allowing all of that. And that feels to me as though it aligns very clearly with social constructionism also. There are some limitations though, and I think this leads us on quite well to it. One of the things that certainly jumps out in all of this is how much we can really test in this kind of Delphi phase, how much we can really, I suppose, assess and to understand through kind of direct discussion, really, the likes of flow and social constructionism. And certainly after the first phase, this is something that I avoided a little bit in terms of being really overt with it. I think this is something that actually is better explored via interviews. And this is where I, as an interviewer, can assist with understanding, because actually the diversity of the sample, which was probably the biggest strength of this research, was actually its biggest limitation. Because the sample was really quite diverse in terms of background, it made it difficult at times to make sure everybody was really talking about the same thing and that we were all in agreement about the same thing when it came to these more kind of complex kind of constructs essentially. Sample size is something that I think will always be it will always be something that we have a look at when it comes to qualitative research. It was relatively small, but quite typical of Delphi research due to the nature of it. I think actually the quality and the kind of depth of the responses really does overcome that, which I know is something that we often associate with this kind of qualitative approach. And I think certainly the fact that this is a multi-method qualitative approach can really assist with that as well. So same thing with researcher bias. This is something that can just never be ignored, and the researcher's perspective will inevitably be part of the analysis. For this reason, I decided to only do half of the literature review in advance before I started this phase. And I think this was just so that I could keep an open mind, essentially. And then also I used NVivo to code the data because I wanted to remain as closely grounded in participants' responses as possible when trying to identify the themes. So we're trying to be as systematic as possible in all of that, to not let too much of my own biases and kind of leak in and be confirming what I might already think, if you see what I mean, which I think actually has been kind of borne out. It's kind of quite positive that actually there were some surprising responses in there that have changed my opinion, because they were overwhelmingly, we were really in agreement. And then the final thing that I'd just like to share with you briefly before kind of opening up for comments and questions is about the next steps for my research. So this is certainly something that I would welcome suggestions, questions on. I dare say actually this approach really aligns with social constructionist principles, and certainly those that my work's based on, at least just in terms of constructing solutions ourselves as a kind of network essentially. I'm planning to add another phase to my research as I showed you before, and this is to take an ethnographic approach to explore the key constructs that have really shone through during the Delphi phase responses, and these are those. So I intend to design sessions where participants can play some games or try some kind of playful or game elements at least, and then observe them through the lens of these kind of social constructs, really. So participants can then be interviewed afterwards, and so or maybe given post-test questionnaires. I haven't quite decided that. I think it's probably interviews, and this can explore their experience of flow state, if any, also the nature of socially constructed realities that they may have operated within, if they feel that they did. It's the kind of thing that could be explored a lot further. And then this would take place before the semi-structured interviews. So I'm still planning to conduct the semi-structured interviews with the same group of experts. And the intention really in that is to explore the kind of total findings around these core constructs in depth with the experts in their fields. And it's with a view to trying to identify those optimal elements really that should go into immersive kind of games that are designed for leadership development. So those things that we might put in a framework that we could kind of use to inform games and how they are developed essentially. So that's everything in a bit of a nutshell, a bit of a kind of potted discussion so far about my research and particularly the Delphi approach. I'd really love, please, any questions, comments, absolutely anything would be great.
Thank you so much, Kristina. Wow, that was amazing. Thank you so much. Do we have any questions from the audience? Lots of clapping, lots of clapping. It's just great. Any questions from the audience? Oh, yes. Hi, we've got one here. Hello. Is it J.I.?
Yeah. Hello. Hello, Kristina. Thank you for your talking. It's really interesting. And I'm a PhD student in Southampton Education School. My research is also about the video games. Yeah, so I'm really interested in your project. And I have two questions. One is about your experience. At this stage, I also use Delphi to try to build the theoretical framework from the academics and game designers. So I want to know your experience about these experts who from different backgrounds. What's the differences between these different groups, and how you deal with these different characteristic data like this?
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. It's a really great question. I've just noted down your details and we'll drop you an email. We need to have coffee as well. It'd be great to stay in touch. I think it's probably the biggest challenge that I found in the Delphi phase was exactly what you're saying. These groups are really, really different to each other. So almost the language that they use, the common language, is not that common. It's different. Their understanding of things and their I suppose what they prioritize is important. I personally think that what would maybe have worked a little bit better and what I might be inclined to do in future is to have 3 separate kind of Delphi investigations going on at once, because it was really challenging. So for example, the games designers wanted to talk about flow and wanted to talk about the actual nuts and bolts of games design, whereas we often had the kind of leadership development experts feel a little bit kind of worried almost about the technicalities of this and really shy away from it. And so what I found is that if I didn't try to remove some of the more technical aspects, we might leave some of the participants behind. So I think what I would consider doing maybe is to kind of split them into groups in future. It's not necessarily the only approach, but I think I'd like to try, that one. I don't know if you'd be inclined to do something like that yourself.
Yeah, great. Thank you for your answer. Yeah, that's also give me some ideas about the data analysis for my project. And another small question about the future steps. You mentioned that you want to do some observation of players who might be included in some serious games like that. And I want to know what's the criteria for you to choose this kind of games that maybe can suitable or link it with your theoretical framework at the first step.
Yeah, there is actually a particular game that I have in mind, which is probably the closest to a leadership development game that I've really ever come across. It's called Fligby. It's the one that I briefly introduced. And the reason I think that maybe might be one, just in terms of going back to your question about the criteria, is I feel that games that are really targeting soft skills development are probably going to be those which are going to be much more useful, because of course we're looking for leadership development here, and of course those that have the opportunity to potentially achieve a state of flow, so a kind of immersive state. So ideally things that are working on social interactions, emotional intelligence, strategic thinking, things we might associate with soft skills. Yeah, thank you. That's a really great question. It's one I think I need to work on a bit more.
Great, thank you, and hope we can maybe have some collaboration in the future. Thank you.
Yeah, great, thank you so much. Yeah, and I'll send you a message afterwards.
Yeah.
Okay, are there any other questions? And while people are being brave enough to ask questions, Kristina, I was just thinking about what you were saying about the diversity of the groups that you have and how problematic that might be if people are speaking different languages. And it reminded me of how difficult it is for people in the arts and humanities to work with people in the sciences, because we do speak very different languages. And of course, now we're being encouraged to work more openly with people who don't speak the same language as us. And I wonder if there is room for development to find ways in which people who have different agendas and different skills could actually work together by playing this game as a group, maybe.
Yeah, I think that that's a really good point. Certainly, I think once a game or at least some kind of playful element essentially are developed, that is the kind of thing that it could certainly work towards. Because I mean, going back to this idea of cooperative versus competitive, one thing that came out really strongly is that cooperative gameplay is preferred and most useful for soft skills development. There seems to be something there about maybe like in-group, out-group dynamics or something like that. Competitive gameplay was actually only preferred when a sense of psychological safety was kind of protected. So I think there's something really interesting there about the potential positive opportunities for really supportive, cohesive kind of social interactions for sure. That's a really good idea. Yeah, thanks very much.
I just think you would make a fortune, not that you necessarily want to make a fortune, but I think it's something that's really desperately needed for all of us actually to work really well together, because we all have something to bring to the table, but perhaps we don't know how to communicate properly.
Yeah.
And also, as you focus on soft skills, those are things that we all can develop. You know, you don't need a particular language, do you? It's a kind of emotional and I suppose sensory or psychological approach to things, which is somewhat different and is more about leadership than actual knowledge, isn't it, and practice. So
Yeah. It really is, and it's a shame because in terms of this kind of joint language and the the kind of conversations that we have and the words we were using, I felt like actually it was more people's own fear or their own kind of sense of apprehension about whether they were able to have the conversation. So if I take the example of the leadership development experts, often what I get is people say, I'm sorry, I don't understand the question. There was kind of once or twice I had that, which was obviously a bit of a concern. And it was around these more technical things. But in their other answers, they showed they absolutely did understand it. It was more their own apprehension. And so I think that it's all about that sense of psychological safety and how we enable that, I think.
I think that's a very interesting point, particularly as this is about leadership. You know, I think that when you're in a leadership role, you don't want to be seen as somebody who may not understand things or may not be able to organise things or answer things properly or in a particular way. You know, so it's quite a vulnerable position and often quite lonely. I mean, I'm just guessing, obviously not having a leadership position, but I think it gives you that sense of you know your own vulnerability in that situation. You don't want to appear to be weaker than the next person, and even though it's not a competitive situation, you are used to being in a competitive situation. Is that making sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of the culture work that I've done over the years in my past life has been around that kind of thing. And almost in leadership development terms, I think the best leaders that we see, and that there's some theoretical thinking, such as Patrick Lencioni's around this kind of stuff, is the best leaders that we see foster that sense of psychological safety by showing there's nothing to be scared of, by making mistakes and by going first and by almost embarrassing yourself, because actually there's nothing to be embarrassed about. And so that's something that it'd be great to really instill in people as well as a leadership style.
I think that's love. I genuinely love that. I think that there's a real move towards compassionate leadership for a start, and I think that sense of fostering those kind of skills is so very important for the future of leadership in general.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more.
Okay. Any other people who are brave enough to share your opinions or ask questions. This, as we've said, is a very safe space, and I'd really like to hear what other people are thinking. I'm guessing everybody's taking all that on board, Kristina. It's just absolutely amazing work that you've done there, and I would like to see this, and I'm sure everybody in the room would like to see this in practice. You know, perhaps you could recruit some of the people in the room to perhaps help you with this, or you know, becoming involved in this in some kind of way. Obviously, you've made some friends already and some contacts, so this is really great. This is great. This is what we want to do. Do you have any closing thoughts before we go, Kristina?
I just wanted to say thank you very much, really, for the opportunity to present my work, especially not in its finished state, you know, just kind of a third of the way in, really. Thanks for the questions, thanks for the comments, and of course, the ability for us to link up as well, which would be great in future. So just to say thank you, everybody, for your time and for coming, and thank you, Joe, for facilitating so so well, and again, for giving me the opportunity to present my research.
Well, I think the pleasure has been all ours. So thank you so much. Thank you also to Ellie for doing all the technical stuff. Kristina, I hope there'll be many, many more opportunities for us to catch up with you as your PhD develops. Thank you so much, and thank you so much for everyone for coming and for your questions, obviously, as well. Thank you all. Okay.
Thank you.
I think it's time to go and have some tea now, maybe.